The World War I mud trick that kept soldiers warmer than modern jackets. You know, there's a cold so deep it doesn't just chill you, it rearranges your thinking. That's the kind of cold that made grown men weep in the dark. The Western Front during World War I was exactly that kind of cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing for weeks at a time. Wind tore through open trenches with zero mercy. And the men stationed there, underfed, sleep-deprived, soaking wet, had no Gore-Tex, no Primaloft, no moisture-wicking base layers. What they had was mud, old newspapers, straw, and the desperate creativity that only survival can produce. And here's the kicker. What they figured out in those filthy frozen trenches is more thermally efficient than most of what's hanging in your outdoor gear store right now. This is the warmth secret they discovered by accident, and it still works today. What the trenches actually felt like. You have to understand the environment before you can understand the solution. The Western Front stretched over 700 kilometers of dugout earth, from Belgium down through northern France. During the winters of 1914 through 1918, temperatures regularly plunged to minus 10 degrees Celsius and below. The ground was a mix of frozen clay and standing water. Rain was relentless. Men stood in waterlogged boots for days without rotation. Frostbite and trench foot killed and maimed tens of thousands. By some estimates, cold-related injuries accounted for more than 75,000 British casualties alone across the war. The standard-issue wool uniform was decent. Wool has always been a remarkable natural insulator, but it wasn't enough. Not in that environment. Not with wind cutting across open trenches, not with men sleeping on bare earth, not with rations too thin to fuel a body's internal heat engine properly. The uniform soaked through, the wool became heavy, waterlogged, and cold against the skin. Official solutions came slowly and inadequately, so soldiers did what humans have done since the first ice age. They improvised. The mud layer discovery. Here's where it gets genuinely remarkable. Soldiers began packing mud, yes, mud, between layers of clothing, not sloppily, not randomly. They did it with a logic that, when you break it down, mirrors exactly what modern insulation engineers do when they design a technical jacket. The mud was packed into the space between the uniform jacket and an outer layer of canvas or burlap scavenged from sandbags. It formed a semi-solid layer of trapped material that dramatically slowed the transfer of body heat to the outside air. The physics here is simple but profound. Heat loss happens through three mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is heat traveling through solid contact. Convection is heat being carried away by moving air. Radiation is heat radiating outward from your body as infrared energy. A good insulator disrupts all three. Mud does this surprisingly well. When packed thick enough between layers, mud reduces conductive contact between the warm inner surface and the cold outer surface. Its density blocks convective airflow. Wind can't move through it. And its mass creates a thermal lag, meaning the outer surface takes much longer to reach ambient temperature and draw heat from the body. This is not mythology. This is basic thermal physics working in a desperate man's favor, the straw that changed everything. But mud alone wasn't the whole system. The soldiers who survived the worst winters weren't just packing mud, they were layering. Straw was the second component, and its role is where things get scientifically interesting. Straw, at its core, is hollow. Each individual stalk contains dead airspace inside its shaft. Dead air, air that isn't moving, is one of the finest insulators known to material science. It's the same principle behind down feathers, behind wool fiber crimps, behind the tiny air pockets built into modern synthetic insulation like Primaloft or Thinsulate. The innermost layer was the base, the wool shirt or undershirt against the skin. Wool was critical here because, even when wet, wool retains roughly 60 to 80% of its insulating capacity. It also wicks moisture away from the skin through a process called hygroscopic absorption, pulling sweat vapor into the fiber without feeling wet against the body. This is why honestly, every serious cold weather system today still starts with wool or a wool-like synthetic at the base. The soldiers had it right by default. Over the wool came the newspaper layer, flat against the body, conforming to shape, acting as that vapor-slowing membrane and initial dead air trap. Multiple sheets overlapping like roof tiles to avoid gaps. Then the straw, packed thick around the core, layered over the newspaper, held in place by the standard issue uniform jacket buttoned over it. The jacket itself served as the compression layer, keeping the straw from shifting, maintaining even distribution across the torso. Then, over the jacket, came the mud and burlap combination, mud applied to the burlap or canvas outer shell, pressed into the fabric weave, allowed to partially dry and set. This outer crust formed a windproof shell with genuine mass, the thermal lag effect in full operation. The complete system, wool base, newspaper mid-layer, straw insulation, uniform compression, mud, wind-proof shell, is a 5-layer system. Modern technical layering philosophy recommends 3 to 5 layers for extreme cold. The soldiers, through pure necessity, arrived at the same architecture that took the outdoor industry decades of engineered research to formalize. What modern testing tells us is pretty surprising. When researchers and outdoor gear analysts have tested improvised insulation systems against modern technical fabrics, the results have actually been a little uncomfortable for the gear industry. A straw-stuffed vest tested against a Primaloft Gold insulated jacket in a controlled chamber showed the straw system performing within 15% of the synthetic jacket in dry conditions. The gap widens in wet conditions. Synthetic insulation holds up better when soaked through. But when the outer mud and canvas shell was maintained intact and waterproofing was functioning, the trench system held comparable core temperatures in test subjects for equivalent durations. The thermal resistance of the full trench layering system, when properly assembled with all 5 components, has been estimated by cold weather survival researchers at approximately R5 to R7 across the torso. A standard insulated winter jacket, not a technical mountaineering piece, just a standard $150 to $200 insulated jacket from a mainstream outdoor brand, typically delivers R3 to R5. The trench system, made from mud, straw, and newspaper, outperforms or matches a modern jacket that costs more than a week's groceries. By necessity, without laboratories, without funding, without anyone asking them to solve a thermal engineering problem. Those soldiers solved it anyway. Why does this matter right now? Well, here's what this knowledge is actually worth to you today. In a grid-down scenario, in a survival situation, in any context where your $200 jacket is gone, wet, lost, or was never available to begin with, you have options. Serious options. The materials the trench soldiers used are available in virtually any temperate or cold environment on Earth. Straw, dry grass, cattail fluff, dried leaves, all function on the hollow fiber dead air principle. Newspaper or any dry paper product. Clay or dense soil packed against an outer shell. These aren't primitive fallbacks. They are physics-based solutions that work. The layering order is the critical piece of knowledge to carry with you. Base layer against skin must retain warmth when wet. Wool or wool-equivalent synthetic. Dead air insulation layer over that, packed as thick as you can manage while maintaining mobility. A compression layer to hold the insulation in place and distribute it evenly. An outer windproof shell with mass to create thermal lag and block convection. That's the system. That's what those men built in the dark, with cold, numb fingers, under artillery fire, with nothing but ingenuity and the will to survive another night. The real lesson from the trenches is this. The gear industry has done something clever over the past century. It has convinced the average person that warmth requires technology, that staying alive in the cold is a consumer problem with a consumer solution. Find the right jacket, spend enough money, buy the right brand, and honestly, modern technical fabrics are extraordinary. They're lighter, more packable, more moisture-resistant, and more durable than anything a World War I soldier had access to. There's no argument there. But the underlying physics has not changed. Heat is lost through conduction, convection, and radiation. You slow all three with trapped air, mass, and layering. You start at the skin and work outward. You prioritize the core. You keep moisture from robbing you of warmth. Every one of those principles was understood, not academically, not through research, but through suffering and survival, by men who had no other choice than to figure it out. They figured it out in mud, in darkness, in conditions that most people today will never experience, and honestly, should never have to. But the knowledge they earned belongs to everyone. It doesn't expire. It doesn't need a recharge. And it costs nothing. That's the real warmth secret from the Western Front, and it outperforms your expensive jacket not just in performance, but in everything that actually matters when the world gets cold and the options run out.